Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more people to trickle in. It's 10 a.m. So we'll get started in a couple minutes. You can grab your coffee, water. If you're cold like me, grab a little blanket or scarf. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation today. All right. Okay, let's start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Neha. I'm the event coordinator at the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. So we host a lot of webinars and other events that I'm sure you've been to. So this conversation here is especially important as we wrap up African Heritage Month. And I'm very excited to hear from our speakers who have dedicated their time and taken the time to educate themselves through their experience, through university and what have you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker for the day, Dr. Wendy Cukier from the Toronto Metropolitan University, also the founder and academic director at the Diversity Institute there. So I'll pass it over to you, Wendy, and then you can do your thing and the rest of.
Great. Thank you so much for including me today. And before we get started, I just wanted to say that I'm joining you from the Toronto area, which is the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. And I know that people are joining us from all over the country, but also the Atlantic region. And all of us are joining from territories that are originally Indigenous. The Toronto Metropolitan University is the university formerly known as Ryerson. And we, of course, are engaged in a fairly active truth and reconciliation process, which has involved changing our name in recognition of the historic wrongs of residential schools and, in fact, genocide of Indigenous peoples. But at the Diversity Institute, we look at many dimensions of difference in the population. And so I'm really thrilled today that the Halifax Chamber is partnering with us on this very important discussion around anti-Black racism and in creating inclusive workplaces. And I'm going to do a bit of a presentation to kick us off, and then we'll have a panel discussion. And let me say at the outset, I apologize for taking space, because I know there is a big discussion. We hear it all the time about sharing space with others. On the other hand, there's also a discussion about how we can't leave these issues specifically to the populations affected. And I know, as someone who's worked on issues related to, for example, women in the tech sector since before most of you were born, starting in about 1990, I know how important it is to have allies talking about issues related to gender. And so that's, I recognize that I don't have the lived experience of anti-Black racism, but I sure have the research that shows that it is real and that we all have to work together to address it. So I'd like to start by sharing my screen, and we will make available copies of the presentation afterwards. We welcome comments in the chat. If some of these issues are very challenging to talk about in a public forum, and so we also are very happy to talk to people one-on-one or have other discussions afterwards. You'll have a chance to provide some anonymous feedback and so forth. So let me get started and talk about the presentation I'm going to give. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Diversity Institute, not because life is marketing and I'm here to promote the Diversity Institute, but because it will give you some sense of the different areas that we work in and why this discussion is so important to us generally and me in particular. Set a bit of the context, talk about the problem, but then really focus some of our discussion on the way forward. And I'm really hoping that that will also be advanced by the discussion with the panel. So, Diversity Institute is located in the Ted Rogers School of Management at Toronto Metropolitan University, and we've been around for over 20 years. We started, in fact, focused on issues around women in technology. I'm actually an IT professor. And currently, we're the research lead for the Future Skills Center, which has lots of partnerships in Atlantic Canada. We lead the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, again, where we partner with many organizations, particularly the Women's Center at the Mount, Dalhousie, and the Lab for Creative Destruction. And we also work with St. Mary's University and many of the experts there. I'm on the board of the Federation for African Canadian Economics with people like Rustam Southwell, who many of you know from the Black Business Initiative in the Atlantic region. We have a lot of stuff going on, and the Halifax Chamber of Commerce is our partner in work we're doing on the 50-30 challenge, which is specifically focused on increasing the representation of women and non-binary people, as well as Indigenous peoples and other diverse groups on boards and or in leadership roles. So we hope we have lots of friends out there and lots of them participating in the session. Just as context, and I know very well because I've been schooled that the context in Atlantic Canada is very, very different than the context, for example, in Toronto. But we also know that overall in the country, the Black population is increasing. And in Atlantic Canada, you really see some of the diversity within the community because you have one of the oldest Black communities in the entire country, and some refer to those as the Indigenous Black community. Then you have, the wave of immigrants that came largely from the Caribbean, and more recently, you've seen the wave of immigrants who have come directly from Africa, and those different populations have very different experiences in the communities. We also know, and this is really important for employers in the audience, that the Black population is younger than the general population. Why does that matter? Because the boomers like me are dying or retiring. I want to do the second before I do the first, as I often say. But what that means is we really are facing labor shortages, and that's something that I know has really shifted in your region in recent years. We also know that an increasing percentage of the Black population were actually born in Africa. And there's much diversity within the community. We also know that a growing percentage of the population is Muslim, and that creates multiple layers of challenges when we're trying to create inclusion. And also often people who are Muslim face discrimination based on their race, but also Islamophobia, which we've seen pretty horrific consequences of. And then finally, we see that increasingly the Black population in Canada is well educated and highly skilled. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm in a business school, and because I'm in a business school, we focus our attention on how diversity and inclusion help advance organizational objectives. It isn't that we're not, that I won't use the double negative. We are committed to social justice, but we also see very clearly the benefits of addressing equity, diversity, inclusion through the business lens, getting access to talent, responding to increasingly diverse markets, driving innovation, creativity. I mean, small businesses in Canada 90% of private sector employment. And that's why the work that's being done to support entrepreneurship and small business is so critically important to us. We also know that organizations that do a good job of this have higher levels of employee satisfaction, higher rates of retention, and that can result in better performance and productivity. And finally, we know that if you mess this up, there can be really severe consequences, not just legal consequences, not just costs, but damage to your brand. So we've been working in this area for quite a number of years. Over a decade ago, we worked with Environics on the Black Experience Project, which really opened my eyes to many of the dimensions of anti-Black racism that we saw in the GTA and the extent to which young people were negatively affected by it, as well as the way in which it permeated every layer of society, whether we looked at schools and the fact that Black youth didn't feel they belonged, whether we looked at post-secondary institutions and the barriers that they put in place, whether we looked at entry to employment and what happened when you compared the pool of Black applicants and you controlled for qualifications, and then you looked at who actually made it in the door to who is at the top of organizations. So lots of evidence, not just by the Environics Institute, the Diversity Institute, and many others, that really documents that this is not an individual's experience with a bad apple. This is a problem that's baked into many of our systems, and so we don't see it. And that's one of the things we work the hardest on, is trying to help people see how their processes and their policies may be creating barriers that they have no intention of putting up. And as I said, the issues with young people are more profound than with older people. We did do a review specifically of representation on boards and in leadership roles relative to the population. And what we found was Halifax, as you know, has a reasonable proportion of residents who are Black compared to many other cities of this size. And we also saw that representation on boards was disproportionate, whether we talked about individuals who are Black or whether we talked about women. We also worked with the Black Business Professional Association during COVID and looked at research which showed if you compared the average Black business in Toronto to the average member of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Black businesses were harder hit by COVID. You can see this on every dimension. So do not have the cash flow to pay April bills. 30% of CFIB members, 80% of BPPA members can survive less than a month. 25% of CFIB members, 85% of Black businesses in Toronto, and we've seen the consequences of that. And then when you ask the question, do you have the capacity to take on more debt? We see that Black businesses are far less likely than CFIB members to be able to even accept loans. And you will recall a lot of the COVID relief programs used loans as the mechanism. I've been around for a really long time, and one of the things that still sticks in my mind, which reflects, I think, Canadians' overall values, but also their self-perceptions, was when Donovan Bailey, how long ago is this? This is almost 30 years ago, good grief. Donovan Bailey, who I guess was a sprinter, relay runner, I don't understand the Olympics, was interviewed by Sports Illustrated, and he was asked about racism in Canada, and he said, we know it exists. People of color don't get the same treatment. Today, we would regard that as a statement of fact. And as I said, we got the evidence to back it up. But in 1996, when Donovan Bailey said that, it was the source of massive outrage. Canadians were deeply offended that anyone would suggest racism was a problem in this country. And one of the things we found with the Black Experience Project that for me was really horrifying was 50% of Black people in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, did not think Canada was any better than the US. They called it racism with a smile on your face. And I think that's something that we really have to be prepared to admit and confront. And we have, certainly since the murder of George Floyd, seen an outpouring of statements of solidarity and commitments. My issue is that we still need to see action. Certainly in 2016, the recognition of Viola Desmond on the $10 bill was a real turning point. And it's funny because, of course, I know her story, but we also think about her now as an iconic Black woman entrepreneur, something that often got written out of history. We also saw the federal government name anti-Black racism, perhaps for the first time, and acknowledge that there was a problem and set up a number of programs. And then, of course, was the murder of George Floyd, and we saw an outpouring across Canada. The thing that is so important about anti-Black racism to me is that a lot of it is invisible. I'm old enough to remember the fight against apartheid in Rhodesia, not just South Africa. I'm old enough to remember the fights about segregation in the Deep South. I remember being a little kid and we were debating things like apartheid and segregation, almost inconceivable today. But overt racism is someone comes and wants a beer in a bar and you say, we don't serve Black people. Someone wants to rent a home and you say, we don't serve Black people. Overt racism is something that most of us can clearly recognize. But systemic discrimination, the kind of discrimination that's baked into our systems and processes, is a lot less visible. And it was interesting because we were looking at the employment equity legislation, which passed in 86, and it originated because of concern for opportunities for Black Atlantic Canadians. Then it morphed into being focused on racialized minorities, but there was recognition, however many years ago that is, that this was a serious problem. And so a lot of the work that we do is trying to help organizations see where discrimination is baked in to their systems and processes. And we do that with data, because data can often show where Black people are missing. And then you can start asking questions about, well, why would that be? And we also put a fair amount of emphasis on what is often referred to as unconscious bias, which is not intentional, but is nevertheless debilitating. I realize that I'm almost out of time, so I'm not going to go through all of this other than to say that we can make some of the data available, but the evidence is really clear. Discrimination is real. It may not be intentional, but that doesn't excuse us from not addressing it head on. And so when we think about solutions, we recognize that there aren't simple solutions for complex problems, that we have to look at societal issues. We have to look at history. We have to look at stereotypes. We have to look at policies. We have to look at infrastructure. We have to look at organizations and how they're situated in those broader contexts and what we can do about policies and programs. And at the end of the day, we have to look at our individual actions and attitudes and behaviors. And we're working really hard with organizations like the BPPA, like the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, for example, to challenge stereotypes in the media, to celebrate Black success. We're focused on looking at legislation and how that can be used to advance diversity and inclusion. There are many voluntary codes. Many of you are familiar with the Black North Initiative, where companies have signed up and said, we're committed to making change. The 50-30 challenge, which I already mentioned, is again a voluntary code, but it's something that signals organizations, whether they're for-profit, nonprofit, big or small, are committed to advancing gender equality and increased diversity. We have tools. We have online tools that will help you through a series of questions actually develop an equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy. Will help benchmark you against other organizations and identify areas for improvement along with best practices. We're very focused on thinking about this through a business lens, thinking about what it means for procurement, for product design, for marketing and support. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to us and how we behave as leaders. So really being prepared to look in the mirror and think about our own biases, as well as what we can do to drive change, is so important. And Nancy will perhaps talk a little bit about the micropedia, but a really good place to start is with the implicit bias test from Harvard, or to really start to understand what microaggressions look like in the workplace. So I'm going to stop there because I really want to make sure we have lots of time for discussion. And I will, at this point, start to introduce our great panel. So first off, many of you know Cynthia Dorrington, who is the president of Vale Associates, Human Resource Management and Consulting, and of course, one of the former leaders from the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. She is doesn't say it here, but I believe she is a chartered accountant, along with her sister, and really is deeply embedded in the business community in Halifax. Along with her, we have Josh Creighton, who is a community engagement specialist from the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. Never met before, but I've heard amazing things about how Josh has had a real impact on driving change in the chamber, and he's a lifelong resident of the north end of Halifax, and so has lots to talk about, both from the point of view of his lived experience, but also what he's been able to do to move the chamber forward in this space. And last but not least is my colleague, Nancy Mitchell, who's a senior manager at the Diversity Institute, and she is a very accomplished young woman who worked with the UN, with UN Women on a whole host of issues related to gender inclusion, which some of you may also be interested in. She's been leading a lot of our consulting with large organizations, including the City of Markham and many, many others, to help them with concrete policies and practices. And she was one of the creators of the micropedia of microaggressions. So please join me in welcoming this great panel. I have some questions that I will ask, but I'm also going to encourage all of you to post questions and comments that we can take towards the end of the session. So what I'll do is, I've given my introductions to you, but I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves and how this issue has affected your work. So start with you, Cynthia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for allowing me to even be a panelist here. I think this is a really important topic and has been for a period of time. I have a company that deals with really people strategy. So really focused on the people side of the house. So which means the institution itself, all the policies and the structures around the institution are one component, but people actually practice within that context. So Wendy, when you talked about a system, and the system is there, if the system is a system that does already have entrenchment of legislation and laws and inequities, it's hard to look at the system as being separate from the people. So having done work in this area for a period of time, I've been in the EDI space for about 20 years. And EDI is one of those funny components because everyone will say, well, we're diverse. Diverse is a known entity for all of us. It's how we portray ourselves, I think, and how we work, live, and play in a system that has embedded racism within it, which people don't really truly understand. But from the makeup of Canada, that's the way it has been, and it's been for 200 years. So we are the older part of Canada, shall I say, 400 plus years old. This is from the beginning of that point in time. There's always been an us and them. Somebody's always been better. And I think as a result, that is how we have formulated, and colonialism didn't help, but that's how we formulated our society. And unfortunately, we are living in a society that's so old. I use the analogy when I do diversity and inclusion type training, any type of training that's on the East Coast, it's more embedded in racism. When I do it on the Western side of Canada, it's impacted by culture more than racism initially. So I see that definitely there is racism within the systems. People that can walk and travel through the systems with ease do not see it. It's the people that are different that will have an impact each and every day, each and every minute while they're in the system. That's just a known reality. So when I saw your stats, I was not surprised at all. And if we did it across Canada, those stats would be higher. So thank you very much for having this. I think this is it's a heavy discussion, but it's a discussion that has to be had if we want to create a better working environment for every single person having the ability to work in the environment.
Thanks so much, Cynthia, and I really appreciate you making the time to join us. Josh, over to you. Maybe you can share your perspectives. Introduce yourself a little bit more, and then also what you see the priorities as being.
Thank you, Wendy. And I want to say thank you to yourself and the Chamber and everyone for making this happen. I always look forward to engaging in conversations as such that really start to dissect some of the societal barriers that people of color face on a daily basis. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I have been with the Chamber for almost 2 years now. And so throughout my previous professional career, it's been pretty heavily involved in the community development sector, I guess. And so, being from a community that is often marginalized and has been continually being displaced over the years, has really embedded within me a passion for community and personal development and social all the social causes that come along with that. And so the opportunity to come to the Chamber was a significant opportunity for myself because, I knew the Chamber as an organization, such a prestigious organization, and I knew the amount of change that the whole community could really bring to the Chamber, and making it more diverse and making it more accessible to folks. And so I've had a blast doing that over the last few years and connecting with different communities. And so, yeah, it's interesting how as I mentioned, most of my background is in community development. However, most of the roles that I've taken in my career have been related to DEI in some retrospect. And so kind of, Cynthia touching on how racism is embedded in our system, I would argue community development skills and DEI skills are pretty correlated, but they're two very different things. And so, by natural selection, if you will, I've been placed in DEI roles, and I've gained an immense amount of experience through that, along with my lived experience. But yeah, it's interesting to, I'll put that out there just for folks to think about, and I'll touch on it more, I'm sure, as we go through the questions. But yeah, I'm just always interested in these conversations and how we can educate the broader society on how folks can feel more included not feel like we're in a box, when we're going throughout our day-to-day lives. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Over to you, Nancy.
Amazing. Thanks so much for having me here today. So as Wendy mentioned, my name is Nancy Mitchell, and I am a senior program manager at the Diversity Institute. So much of the work that I do focuses on supporting the Black community, but particularly with an intersectional lens. So we were involved in the Rise Up Pitch competition to support Black women entrepreneurs. But also some research on the socioeconomic status of the Black Muslim population in Canada to really understand, demographic characteristics, immigration, education, and employment experiences, activities, and organizational engagement. And I think it's so crucial to recognize that when we talk about the Black community, of course, there are common and shared struggles that we all experience, but then there's also intersectional struggles related to Black women, Black individuals of different religions, Black youth, and so forth. So a lot of my work focuses on collecting quantitative experiences or data to understand disparities and barriers. But then it also involves collecting the stories of Black individuals and that more qualitative piece, because I think the stories are equally as important to set the whole narrative. And of course, as we already mentioned, we do have a lot of the data and a lot of the stories to kind of paint that picture, but it's something that I still think is important to collect. And then in addition to understanding the data, our work focuses on developing solutions for change, whether that's broad scale solutions or strategies to support Black individuals in the Canadian workforce as a whole, or whether it's more intentional and granular solutions for different organizations across industries that can be more tailored and focused to support the Black community. So that's a little bit about the work that we do and the work that I do, and looking forward to the discussion. So thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. I just wanted to, I learned, one of the things that's important about EDI generally, and any of these topics in particular, is you can't really be an expert and kind of rest on your laurels. I'm always learning all the time. And I'll tell you, one of the things I learned this week from one of my engineering colleagues who was doing a session on equity, diversity, and inclusion, which I think is so pertinent here. He said, accomplishment equals talent plus opportunity plus time and resources. Okay, accomplishment, when we look at someone's resume, when we look at someone's status in life, often we think about self-made people. But if you apply this lens, and when you're thinking about talent, for example, you have to recognize that accomplishment is a result of talent, raw talent, but also opportunity and resources, time, money, and so on. And therefore, he said, math is hard, but I thought this was brilliant. He said, talent, therefore, equals accomplishment minus opportunity or privilege minus resources or time. And in that small statement, it just blew my mind, because it's one of the things that is so hard to communicate. But when you look at somebody, when you look at their resume, when you look at their self-presentation, it's so important to recognize that some of it may reflect raw talent, but it also reflects the opportunities that they've been given. It also reflects the access to resources that they've had. And so I think everybody has talked about the importance of trying to recognize where anti-Black racism focuses or gets baked into our systems. So I'll come back to you again, Cynthia, and ask, we've talked about the problem now. I'd like to spend the rest of the discussion really focusing on practical solutions, things that organizations can do to address the systemic problems, to address their policies and practices, and to address, individual awareness and behaviors and so on. So can you talk a little bit about where you would like to see people focus?
Sure. You actually spoke at the very front end in your presentation about employment equity and why and how employment equity came to be as a result of Blacks in Atlantic Canada. I think if we look at an Employment Equity Act, it is federally regulated, which means only federal regulated organizations have to adhere to it and or follow it. And of course, there is structure around putting some follow through in this in regards to having the right people putting the systems in and looking at those and reporting on a yearly basis. But I think that organizations can use aspects of that because most organizations are provincially bound and so do not have to adhere to the Employment Equity Act. And as such, there's the rigor is not built into their HR system. So having done employment systems reviews for organizations, one of the things I've found is that the system itself, it is some of the entrenchment of the practices. So legislation in Nova Scotia, if people don't realize this, there was legislation in Nova Scotia from the time that we really abolished slavery in the 1830s. Legislation was put on the books in Nova Scotia, and even as Canada came into being in the 1860s, basically where Blacks could or could not work, or actually frequent, where they could stay, how they could travel. There was a lot of legislation put on the books around the us and them. It was a Black, white, and Indigenous. And because of that legislation, that was baked into practice. That was baked into systems that started to morph from this legislation and systems being built to the point that those things did not come off. And some of them never came off for quite a long time. But we saw the change and the shift after the civil rights movement in the South. And that legislation was signed off. Canada then said, we can't do this. We can't be an us and them. So we're gonna take it away. But the practice was there. The institution was built around that practice. And so if you were going to change something, it would have been taking and looking and revamping the institution at that point in time, which we did not do. So I think employment equity, what it offers is an employment system review. So looking at the practice of hiring, promotion, how you have outreach strategies, who you look for within your workforce, what your workforce should look like, dependent on the clients that you serve. All of that focuses on how an organization can, first of all, align itself and test itself on how open they are and welcoming they are. And then all of that is also entrenched in the culture of the organization. So people will tell me, and I've worked in this industry for 20 years, they'll say harassment or discrimination. Well, we don't have it. I said, but the practice, it's how people practice, it's how they walk and live and breathe it on a daily basis. If it's already something that we're used to and we just shy away from, so we see somebody being discriminated against, as a white person, you don't step into that space and say, I'm sorry, that's unacceptable behavior in this environment. When you don't do that and you allow it to happen, then you're actually helping to precipitate the issue and or the problem. Because again, if I don't feel I have a voice, and when you look at the numbers that you provided, Blacks and people of color don't always have voices, and they're not in those power positions to have voices. So when you don't have that voice, you feel like you don't have an ally. And I'm glad you talked around allies, because they don't have to always look like us, but they have to be on the same side, wanting to promote and precipitate where we're at. So I think really it's around understanding your organization, what policies you have. That sometimes with an ESR, I actually do a deep dive on the policies and read the policies word by word, because words have meanings and phrases have meanings, which really in the end lead to practices. And then I look at those practices to find out, are the practices open and welcoming? And if not, where are some of the barriers? And when an organization gets a report back, they realize, holy crap, we do have barriers to success for people. Not only entry barriers, but promotion barriers or movement barriers. Or we do have a churn because our culture is not there. Our culture is very limited. So as a result of actually undertaking some of those components as an organization, I think you as an organization will actually see what you have to do and then make the necessary changes. But I think it really means that organizations, I do believe, have to step up to say, listen, let us analyze our organization to find out if we have barriers. And then let's not fight and say we don't. Let's acknowledge them and then say, how do we shift and change and what is needed? And it's not based on what is needed it's also meeting the people where they're at. What do they need? What do they need the culture to look like? It's not about defining a new culture without the voices off, the people that have been outside of the system. I think you also have to bring them into the system and actually have that discussion of what does a culture look like if we're being inclusive? What does that look like? Instead of one group, again, defining what that culture is. That's what got us into this problem. And it's not going to get us out of this problem. We have to be open and we have to be allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, because vulnerability means that it's not that you're wrong in any way, shape, or form. It's that we are at a point that everybody is vulnerable in some way, shape, or form. But we walk through this thinking that it's not my fault this happened. But if you're still walking in that practice, then you're allowing it to continue to happen.
Really good points. Really good points. Bouncing off that, Josh, what are your priorities for making change? What should organizations be doing?
One of the things we actually do here at the Chamber, which is one of the reasons why I was so keen to take on this role, is Cynthia touched on the theme of practice, and when you're trying to change a culture, it's so important. With anything, the more practice you get, the increased ability you have at success. And so it's so important for organizations to create that initial step in having a DE&I policy or an inclusion policy. But even a step further, here at the Chamber, we developed an action plan, which forces us to report to our board every quarter, as well as to our members. And so we developed 5 goals related to our basic set of business operations that have diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion built into them. So we have a goal, as a membership-based organization, we have a goal related to diversify our membership. And so out of our 1,800 members, for most of the 100 years of our existence, you can bet that most of the population were white males. And so our goal there is to obtain 100 new members of diverse backgrounds in a 2-year period. And so at this point, we're at 80, and we continue to work and drive those membership numbers and bring on new cultures and new community members to our membership. With that, though, we also, it would be a shame if we brought on a bunch of these new members to our membership, which I mentioned is predominantly white males. Maybe when we host an event, we bring a new member from a different community that has a terrible experience because they face racism or they face, exclusion in some way, shape, or form. So because of that, another goal that we have is related to education. We have to provide constant education to our membership board and staff. And so we need to host at least 1 quarterly educational event or training for, like I said, our membership board and staff, so that from the top down, the education kind of drives through our leadership team, through our staff, and through our membership. We also, in partnership with Ryerson, we follow suit with the 50-30 challenge. And so that's crucial for us, obviously, and always ensuring that we have diversity amongst our leadership and our board and leadership. And then finally, we host so many events here at the Chamber. We have 2 other goals related to those events, which relates to representation. I wouldn't want to show up to an event where there's no experts who look like me speaking on any of the topics, because the information isn't relevant to me as a person of color, because kind of what, like you mentioned earlier, Wendy, about that equation, if it's not relevant to my experience, then how am I going to make it tangible for myself to get there? And so representation and speakers at our events is a huge priority for us, as well as the procurement supply chains as well. And so when we host our events, it's important for us to look for, Black-owned AV companies, catering from diverse suppliers. All of that is so important. And so those 5 quarterly goals and myself kind of managing that ensures the progression of it, as well as the growth of it as well. And so that's kind of how the action plan very much brings our policy to life, and so that folks can kind of see it in day to day, week to week, month to month, really creating impact.
Such good points, and I'm really glad we're recording this session. There's an expression, nothing about us without us, and I think increasingly we're seeing everybody, consumers, corporate buyers, everybody taking a long, hard look at who's providing services and whether the people providing the services look like the people being served. And I know as a woman, some of you may know the expression manels. And I think might have been Andre Picard, the writer for the Globe and Mail. He simply said, I will no longer participate in manels. If a panel is all men, I will not participate. And I think it's the same notion, Josh, that you're mentioning, is thinking, often we birds of a feather. We think of the person we went to school with or we golf with or whatever, whether it's looking for someone on a board or a panel or the next hire. And we have to break those habits because they're bad habits. Nancy, I know you've got lots of ideas on this. Do you want to share your perspective?
I have so many, but I'll keep it concise. I think that one of the most effective ways in ensuring that organizations really support the Black community is through a whole of organization approach, and really embedding these efforts throughout organizational structures. I think this work is most effective when it's intentional and baked into the efforts that exist rather than something that's added on as an afterthought. So something that we often say at our organization when we're talking about EDI initiatives or supporting the Black community is that these efforts don't just exist within HR, although I think that that's a really crucial component. There are levers for change that exist throughout the organizational process. So if we're thinking about HR in particular, we can be thinking about the hiring and recruitment process, because I know and studies show that there are so many biases and barriers that are baked into these processes that stop Black individuals from even getting into the workforce to begin with. But then on the flip side, there's so many ways in which organizations can support the Black community in other aspects of their organization. So thinking about product design, thinking about marketing practices, thinking about procurement opportunities, like Josh mentioned, whether you're engaging Black-owned businesses in supply chains, vendors, et cetera. So I think thinking about the whole organizational structure is really important. But I do think a real catalyst for this is leadership. So if you have diversity at the leadership level and whether your leadership is prioritizing these efforts. And so I would say something like the 50-30 challenge, for example, is a really great way in which organizations can be intentional and set goals and targets. But I think it's about, that tone from the top piece really sets the tone for what's prioritized in the organization. And I think it's about both ensuring that Black individuals are at the decision-making table across Canada and in organizations across Canada, but then ensuring that when they're there, their perspectives are respected and valued, which goes back to Cynthia's point about inclusive workplace cultures. So.
Yeah, no, I think all super important points. And, it's interesting because we've got not just diversity of experience here, but also diversity in terms of ages. And I think those of you, I don't know, can't see the audience names, but, I would be astonished if many of the employers on the call are not really challenged to find talent. I assume, Cynthia, and Josh, you're nodding, that it's a problem in your community as it is here. And the point that I keep trying to make to employers is, if you're only hiring people who look like you're probably fishing in a pretty small pond. And so really thinking about how all of this plays out for the business, how this makes you a more effective business, a more successful business, because you'll be able to attract and retain talent. And it's certainly young people are not going to work in organizations that don't reflect their values anymore. I mean, we see that over and over and over again. Certainly customers are starting to apply this lens, investors and others. So I think it's so important to really, as you all have, bring that back to, this is not just like a nice thing to do. This is an essential thing to do, whether you're a hospital, a university, a small business, or Starbucks. We just did the Nancy worked on the EDI strategy for Starbucks. And one of the things they're doing is thinking very strategically about how markets are changing and how they have to serve those new markets. So I think we've got a few minutes left, and let's talk about, we talked about sort of broad systemic issues. We talked about organizations. Now let's drill down to what individuals should and can do. And Cynthia, you sort of alluded to this when you said don't be a bystander, but maybe you can talk more about what everyone in the audience can do to advance this.
First of all, don't use the phrase "I have a Black friend." That irritates me, because I think I have a white friend as well, and I think we have many friends. But most importantly, I think understanding that we are all diverse, we come from different lenses. The most important thing to understand is there is racism. So let's acknowledge it and say it is there. There's enough evidence that shows that we have barriers. And some of those barriers are built on in the fact that it's a system, and the system, and myself having done employment systems reviews and providing reports back to government, I know that they're there. But how do you play a role in breaking it? And I think most importantly, acknowledging that if you have bias, acknowledge those bias. And how do you overcome them? They're not just going to go away because you acknowledge them. It's what education do you have to put in place? What do you have to learn? Who do you have to talk to, consult with? Be in safe spaces to do some of that, but at the same time, acknowledge it. Because if we don't acknowledge our own bias, our own issues, we're never going to get to anti-Black racism, for example. So the training that I've done, a lot of people say, well, I'm not racist. But again, when they say to me, well, I have a Black friend. Well, to me, that comment and you saying you're not racist, it's sort of an oxymoron, because when you can say you have a Black friend, I have lots of friends who are white. So I just sort of say, well, why would you use that phrase even? Because sometimes phrases mean something. So it's really assessing ourselves, but also being aware that if people are being harassed or discriminated against, you can stand up and say, I don't appreciate that. And as an employee or even an employer, it's a responsibility to make sure that your employees are safe in the workplace under human rights legislation and all our provinces. That is your accountability and responsibility from an employer perspective to your employees, but also creating a culture that is more open and appealing and people want to work, live, and play in. That is, you're actually opening yourself to people knocking on your door. So you're not really sourcing people. You have so many people knocking on your door that you have the ability to pick and choose. So you become more of an employer of choice. So years ago, we used to talk about that phraseology, but I think we actually have to be aware how that does impact us and how it can play out. But ultimately, suffice to say, I've heard more people say in my lifetime, I'm not racist. I like all Black people. Like, to me, those phrases mean something. It means that you may not be 100% comfortable, because if I wasn't racist, I wouldn't be going out saying that I wasn't racist, because my actions, my words, who I align with will dictate and show that I'm not. So I wouldn't have to keep saying that, because when I keep saying that, then to me, it causes me to have a little bit of unease that maybe there is something here, because they're saying it too often. Once too often. So again, I think it's really understanding what anti-Black racism is, what discrimination is, so that you truly understand some of those nuances, because I don't think people truly understand anti-Black racism, because they hear racism, so they're assuming, oh, it's just racism. But there is a definite difference between racism and anti-Black racism. And I think that people have to understand the difference and then try to understand how to educate themselves, what tools they need to affect change, what the organizations need to affect change, because I think we are a changing demographic here in Halifax. Over the last 10 years, I have seen a different face of Halifax, and it will continue to grow because of our immigration needs. And if we're not open to and accepting people that are different from us, then we will have struggles within our society that will continually exist, because we're not open for change. And I think The big word here is we have to be willing to change. We can't be something from the past and want that for the future. We have to say we're changing every single day and every single minute. How do we change to be the best of the person we can be, accepting of all?
Thanks so much. And I'm conscious, I am conscious of the time, but Josh, can you add anything? What can individuals do? Cynthia's given us a big list of stuff. What else can we do?
Yeah, I think, obviously for someone who, isn't living under the constraints of a racist society, it's like Cynthia mentioned, it's so harder to recognize and acknowledge those nuances that even the little ones that happen in the workplace, outside, in any kind of endeavor that you find yourself in as a person of color. And so acknowledgement is a huge piece, especially in the related to employment, or in the workplace. Oftentimes in most workplaces, you're the only person of color there. And so in order to progress in said professional field, maybe you experience some racism and maybe you feel like you can't address it immediately because of the impact it will have on your professional career. And so that's a constant struggle that folks of color have. And so folks can honestly just educate themselves, show up to a webinar, go to an event, read books, read articles. I mean, it's that simple. I think the more when you're not living with the constraints, right, you don't see them as much as you would if you live with these experiences. So my recommendation would be just keep educating yourself, like with any subject you'd like to learn, and then you'll be able to spot it out more frequently and be able to acknowledge those things with your colleagues of color and be able to sympathize and lend support with them in the right way. So constant education, I would recommend.
And Nancy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I agree with what's been said. As Wendy mentioned, I've been working on the micropedia of microaggressions. I do think that a lot of the times in non-inclusive workplace cultures go back to our daily interactions, the things we say to one another, the way we treat one another, the jokes we make, the supposed compliments we give one another, the general comments. And ultimately, and I think these are really prevalent in the workplace, what these come down to are levels of microaggressions. And these are the everyday snubs, slights, et cetera, whether they're intentional or not intentional, that can other a person or make them feel invalidated or unwelcome. So something like, wow, you're a credit to your race. Or in the workplace, I think we can hear something like, wow, you got the job. I wouldn't have expected that. Or you would look so much more professional if you changed your hair. Things like this, right? That we say that maybe we think are pieces of advice, or maybe we think are just like some subtle comments that we don't think too much of, but they really reflect our biases and the expectations we put on different racialized people, particularly Black people. And so my theme for this webinar is really intention. I think that it's important to investigate why you're saying a particular thing, what you really mean by that. So when you say, wow, you got the job, what are you really saying through that? What biases are you kind of revealing through your language and through your phrasing? I think we've offered strategies for people to be good bystanders and good allies, but I think if you are the one who has said that, it was an accident, et cetera, you didn't really realize it was revealing your bias, whatever it is, you're the person who has caused it, apologize, listen to the person who has taken the time to educate you, and then make a pledge to do better. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. And we do have a question in the chat, but I think we are out of time. So I will promise that we will address it because it's so important. It's a question about how not to seem like a white savior when you're trying to be an ally. And I think we'll get comments from everybody and share that with the group. But at this point, I would like to turn the last minute over to the Halifax Chamber to wrap up.
All right. Thank you very much, Wendy and Cynthia and Josh and Nancy. I know I was glued to my screen. I had to use the bathroom, but I took my laptop with me because I just wanted to learn more because as everyone has kind of mentioned, there's always more learning and you can never stop that journey. I know even as like a person of color, like there are behaviors that I might exhibit maybe through like years of cultural training or societal training that are not actually right behaviors. And so in my current work and phase as well, I'm constantly learning, and I know the chamber is doing the same. So we really appreciate your time trying to help us become more cognizant of how our actions and words, or even the smallest behaviors, may impact and create this butterfly effect for someone else. We are at 11 o'clock, so I am not going to take a lot more of your time. The only thing I'll say is, we're wrapping up African Heritage Month, but that's not the end of the learning. It's not just for February. So we're going to keep this conversation going, going to keep the education moving forward. We are having our Surge conference on March 24th. Dr. Wendy will be there, and Josh and myself. And so if you have more learning to do, which all of us have, so it's not even a question of if, I encourage you to come to the conference and learn together with us. Thank you very much, and I'll see you guys next time.
And you won the competition. Clearly, folks in the East Coast are more polite than folks in Toronto, because 32 showed up out of the 40 who registered.
Ah, I'm so pleased.
All right. Bye,
Thanks,
folks.
everyone. Bye.